do some quick introductions to those folks that are going to be joining us for a conversation, and then what we're going to do. We're going to have a conversation facilitated by those folks nice enough to let me wrangle them into coming up and talking with us today, but it's a conversation that is also intended for you to participate in. So we're also going to be interested in wanting to hear your thoughts. I mentioned that we've been working on this for a few years. I've said like 6 times. I don't normally do that. I'm going to blame it on like flight and other things. I did it again. Okay. We are, I mentioned, going to be ending this, but that doesn't mean the topic ends. It moves forward. So I just want to keep that in the front of our minds, that some of what we're reporting out today is the last time we're going to talk about it for a while. We really want to move into being more actionable. Okay, in all conversations, always want to hear open dialogue. At the same time, want to acknowledge that one of the purposes of this group is to acknowledge that public lands and restoration mitigation on public lands is a worthwhile action. And so somewhat regardless of any one hurdle, the goal is always to move forward to a solution as opposed to identify a reason not to, if that makes sense. So as opposed to bringing an opinion that's, I don't think we should do this because, instead it should be, this is a hurdle, we're looking for a solution, what does that look like? Because at the end of the day, we have a massive amount of public lands that are underfunded, and they're going to remain underfunded, and we want to be able to use those private dollars to improve our public lands while also facilitating the business of mitigation. I'm not even talking into that. Sorry. Ignore me. Okay, so let's finish getting on the same page. So I already mentioned, or asked you guys to think about why you're here. So this is a little bit about why I'm here and why at least those folks that I've been talking about this with are here. Because we have a lot of work to do, not as an industry, but as a human population. And regardless of what camp in the world you sit in, I think we can all acknowledge that there's a lot of room for improvement in how we take care of our natural resources, which is why we're here talking about mitigation and restoration. But a lot of those issues have been exacerbated and are, we're seeing the impacts, the outcome of those coming to fruition quicker. And the economic impact on that is significant. And so that's, kind of one element. And we have different issues everywhere. So continuing to think about where do you live in this country and what are you facing or what is your family facing or your companies. So, we've got everything from wildfires to flooding to more significant tornadoes or higher frequency. And these are things that are changing regardless of what and why and how they're happening. And we as a population ideally are trying to adapt to that. And once again, tapping into our public lands is a powerful place to put some time and energy. And then for me, I always talk about I'm a super big skeptic and not the biggest fan of human beings and all those things, but I then went and decided to have a kid. So now I'm all in. I, have a limit on myself, but this is my small human and I really want the planet to stay a good place for her and for whoever and whatever she decides to have in her life. And so, I have to find the hope in that we can solve problems together. And so this is one of the reasons why public lands for me is so significant, and also why I do ecological restoration. It's something that, they talk about, managing the things you can manage. And so these are the small pieces that I can manage. And if we each take those small pieces and manage them, we can do a lot more together. So, and then also another why is because the resources need it. So these were the images that were on the opening slide, and you can see I picked all these beautiful images. Every year I change what pictures are up here. The amount of time I spend finding the right pictures is kind of stupid, but we've got an eelgrass bed, there's the desert from the southwest, we've got the plains, we've got the Pacific Northwest, and we've got the Everglades. And each one of these is a beautiful picture of a public land that looks in pristine state. And it probably is, or close to it. But those are not the public lands that we're talking about. We're talking about the public lands that are being impacted significantly by a wide variety of issues, be it invasive species, invasive pests. And so I want to make sure that when we're talking today that we remember that this is what we're talking about. And these resources, regardless of whether we think they should or shouldn't be funded better, we have some ability to make some changes here. And so that's where this conversation about private dollars and public lands comes into play. And unfortunately, we're competing, for lack of a better word, with Gray, who's having a great conversation next door about public lands and funding your mitigation project. And so there's a lot of good conversations happening around this. And I already showed this, so I'm not even going to go into it anymore. And how are we doing on time? Okay, and then another why, because really everybody can benefit. If done correctly, in the right location, and under the right circumstances, this is really a win-win-win-win-win, and every time I write this, I've added another win category, but then the words get too small. So the land managers win, the project proponent, the banker wins, the agencies win, and the general public wins. And that's a really powerful opportunity. It's a really powerful place to be, and I think a really great thing to be bringing to, to businesses and to our public lands. So there's a long history of, this is one of the things that when I realized this or thought about it, was just like a light bulb. And sometimes it's really funny when you have light bulbs that are so obvious, but until you say it out loud, you're like, oh. So we spent the first year or two talking about this idea of, and it still happens in parts of the country where people are like, you should not make money on public lands. It is not okay for you to make money on public lands. And I was like, well, shoot, is that a real issue? Should we not make public lands? Why? What does that mean? We talk about land value. But then at some point, someone, and I don't even remember who, started pointing out, this already happens all over the place. There are already people making money on public lands all over the country, all over the world, I'm sure. So whether it's, fossil fuels, fisheries, rangeland, extraction of minerals, recreation, and other types of extraction, logging, solar, like these are all things that are happening in public lands regularly. They happen, most of it we don't even think about anymore, right? These are all things that we're used to seeing as we drive wherever you live in the country. I'm sure you have your top 3 things that you see. If you're in the West Coast or Southwest, you're seeing solar farms, maybe some rangeland. If you're on the coast, you're probably seeing fisheries. But these are all things that you're gonna see. And there's one thing that all of these have in common, at least in my opinion. They are consumptive and or extractive. They are actually taking something from the public land while also generating funds. And I'm stating no opinion about whether that's good or bad, just that's the reality of that's a common denominator with those. But compensatory mitigation in the banking industry can be different, and truly is different. If we do things the right way, it is different. It requires measurable ecological benefits. So this is a use of public lands that gives back to public lands while generating revenue. Revenue both for potential private entities, but also potential revenue back to the public lands. And that's, once again, a really powerful place to be. And I mentioned that when this light bulb came on for me, I was like, holy cow. And I was talking to a land manager in California a month ago and basically did that same spiel in 2 sentences without a PowerPoint. And they were like, oh my gosh, I never thought of it like that. But our agencies keep telling us, no, you can't do a mitigation bank on your land. No, you can't do it because it's not okay. And when I said this, they're like, oh my gosh, like it's just simple, but yet sometimes we need to say it out loud. So, and then there's a lot of momentum, whether it's momentum from this conversation in our industry, whether it's momentum from policies happening at a national, local, state level, and even at a global level. There's a lot of focus on ecosystem restoration. And I think of the mitigation banking industry as kind of one of the gatekeepers, this really unique opportunity to talk about having successful businesses while doing good work. I mean, I don't know that there's a much better way to operate a business and an overall path forward. So, okay, let's catch up. I'm talking too long already. So who's been participating in this conversation? We had a good group of people raise their hands. Many of those people, some in the room, some that aren't in the room. So we've had state agencies, many federal agencies, consultants, bankers, water districts, land managers, academia, land trusts, and more. So there have been a lot of folks that have participated in this conversation to date, not always balanced as far as who and how many are in the room, but it's been great to have that engagement. Oops. So I wanted to, one, acknowledge that what I'm going to talk about today is only what happened, is only what's happened in my last 6 years, really kind of focused on this topic. But this is not a new topic in our industry. It's been discussed since the mid-90s, and in some cases have success stories that started in the mid to late 90s. And so it's not new, And sometimes you just have to rehab conversations to get more momentum than you did potentially the last time. But that's something I want to acknowledge. We're not going to go into all of that history of what happened. I'm going to start with where we were in 2019, which was the year after we had a public lands just general presentation session, had a lot of really good feedback, realized that there were a lot more questions and concerns that we needed to dive into, and started kind of this working session. So in 2019, what does this first thing say? Okay. In 2019, we basically did a half day, maybe it wasn't even a half day. It was a quarter day design charrette where we threw all these people in the room with no food, like we did not properly prepare for the amount of people that would be there. They were all exhausted by the end. But we did basically a challenge charrette, and we identified 3 challenges that we wanted to really hash out, and had spent some time talking about that. So this is what that room looks like. I'm sure quite a few of you were in that room. A lot of Post-its, but you basically go through kind of a series of exercises to move toward a place of consensus. And this is a great exercise if you haven't participated them in general. If you have a big group of people with lots of different opinions, this is a great way of kind of moving toward consensus because you're engaged the whole time. Whether your opinion is the ultimate consensus one or not, you've participated in identifying that consensus point. And so it's a powerful place to start. So, and before we go into more of what that looked like, I wanted to talk about the 3 challenges that we dove into at that point and just give you the definitions in case these words are used more today. So one of the big things we hear a lot about is additionality. So this is the concept of needing to have a net gain of natural resource values, services, and functions relative to baseline conditions, and needs to be demonstrably new. So a lot of public lands, not a lot, all public lands are preserved, right? They're protected. So whatever work is happening needs to somehow, and the credits and the funding or the identification of those credits need to acknowledge that that land is protected. It's already removed from, potential development. I will say that that does not necessarily mean in the world of aquatic resources and even other resources that you still can't have creation of, or I'll say reestablishment and establishment of actual resources, but the footprint you're working in is already protected. So that needs to be acknowledged. On top of that, the other thing that is often needs to be acknowledged is the fact that the land manager, whoever that entity is, already has some responsibility. And so an entity should not be able to come in, pay to do work that somebody else is already tasked and conceptually funded to do. So those are questions that have to be acknowledged. So that's kind of where the additionality world comes into play. And then the next one is durability. So once again, this is the concept of having a measurable environmental benefit that are sustainable and reasonable. So they need to, this is like more site protection mechanisms. So just because something's on public land does not mean that everybody is comfortable that that land use cannot change. And so what does that look like? Is that a deed restriction? Is that a restrictive covenant? Is that an MOU or an MOA or some other agreement? And the answer, there's not one answer, but those are the questions that we need to ask when we're talking about public land and durability. And the last is funding and long-term management. This, in my mind, is a lot like additionality. If the land manager is already receiving some type of funding for some baseline services, the long-term management and funding for mitigation needs to be over and above that, and you need to be able to document what your funds are paying for, what they're not paying for, how that's being divvied out. So these are all like logistical hurdles. And by hurdle, it means people can jump over them, but it means you have to stop and think before you do that. So these are the 3 topics that we talked about at that time in that 2019 meeting. Do you like the little koala? I thought, first I was looking at people hugging trees, and that wasn't as cute as a koala hugging a tree. I was like, what kind of picture shows long-term management? I don't know. Okay, challenge statements. So this was where we started. So the group voted on and grouped on like the primary challenges associated with each one of those 3 topics. So you basically, everybody throws up Post-its and you all get stickers and you start voting. And you start seeing consensus, like, oh, that one everybody agreed on. And then you move those forward. And once they get grouped, you start kind of moving them out and looking at them closer together to see where you have similarities. And then you put them in this XYZ, I can't think of what to call that, graph. And you do it kind of really simply, like where do you get the biggest bang for your buck? You're looking for your lowest hanging fruit first of all. So where do you have low effort for high benefit? And so this is the exercise you then do for the solutions to those challenges. And then we asked them all to put together, each group, there were 6 tables, we asked them to put together an action plan. Some of them looked really pretty, and some of them were really messy and simple, but they all had a very similar kind of theme to them, and it was pretty much a 5-year plan. And so this was, after we compiled all of that, this was what we put together to kind of visualize what the groups identified as the action plan. And so that green arrow is where we're sitting today. For those of you here last year, the green arrow didn't move very far. I'm happy to take responsibility for that because putting together a white paper is not in my normal skill set, and I think I just need to take like a vacation, a white paper vacation, and go finish writing it. But a lot of great people have contributed to a draft white paper and with the intent of us having it finished really in the next few months. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that because we'd like to hear from the group about where and how the white paper could be released in a way to be most beneficial to you. Is it coming out through an academic institution? Is it coming out through a resource agency? Is it coming out through a nonprofit entity? I don't know the answer to that, so if people have thoughts, that's one of the questions we have for you. And then I did want to just put in COVID happened somewhere in there, and so I'm going to lean on that. I feel like I have another year or so where I can say that my current failures in expediting something are COVID related, but we did make work even happen during that time. So, okay, and then these were just some of the solutions that came out. So you can see one was the low effort, medium impact, which was the white paper. Number 2, low effort, medium impact is case studies and or pilot projects. So case studies conceptually have already happened, right? You can case in point, prove something, this is how we did it, this is how we solved it. Whereas a pilot project might actually be working through this exercise, be it with BLM to go through their new procedures, be it with a land manager or a landowner to go, a public land manager to go through an MOU, but it's kind of working through the exercises and the solutions we've identified. And then high effort, high impact were other things such as agency-specific guidance, potentially changes to policy. And I should mention, although the white paper and a lot of our conversation has a tendency to focus on federal lands, it is certainly in the intent of the group to be facilitating mitigation restoration on public lands of all types, be it state and local. For me, I actually spend a lot more time on local public lands and state public lands. But the hope was that federal lands, if you can solve a problem for federal lands, hopefully there's some of that trickle-down effect where a state land manager or a local land manager can hold up those solutions and say, hey, this worked for the federal government and here's their recommendations, and so it can work for us. But number 3 is an important one because there are policies, especially at local and state levels, that are potentially more of a hurdle than you see at the federal level for mitigation on public lands. So it's just something that's important to acknowledge. Okay, so now what we're going to do is dive into introductions. So this is meant to be casual. I've talked a lot. Hopefully that first 15 minutes felt casual because it was like chaos. But we're going to have a group of us come up, maybe stand, maybe sit. We might be too short if we're sitting, I don't know. But we have a group of folks that have, I mentioned, been willing to have this conversation a little more and dive into some questions. So I would love them each to introduce themselves, take a seat up here with me, and then I'm going to attempt to /moderate. It's never good to have an opinion and be a moderator, but I'm going to work really hard at letting them speak and just moderating. And that's that. That's really what we want to do with the rest of our day, is dive further into some of these conversations. And then we are having, Devlin, maybe you'll help me remember, when is the emerging markets? Is that Wednesday?
There's 2 kind of emerging markets. There's one.
Which one are you doing?
7 and one in session 11. I think 11, session 11 is the one you're thinking about.
Yeah, and when is that, do you remember if it's Wednesday or Thursday? I'm going to look it up.
It's Thursday.
It's Thursday. Okay. I'm going to double check this, but emerging markets conveniently has quite a few public land conversations happening in it. So between now and Thursday, if you have more thoughts, we'd love to encourage you to come to that session. I'm going to find it at some point. But we'd love to have you come to that conversation. Many of us that are going to be up here are going to be here the whole week and would be happy to chat. I mentioned the white paper. We will be closing that over the coming weeks, months, with the intent that that's something that we can distribute to everybody, ideally by the end of third quarter. Okay, so with that, let's see. I threw up a whole bunch of people's names. So I had this grand plan of making a Zoom call and having some virtual folks join us. But unfortunately, unless something changed, which I don't think it did, they can only hear. It did change or didn't? Yeah, so I'll let you know who's on the call. They cannot talk to us via their vocal cords, but they can type in thoughts. So they're still here, and at least want to mention who's on the call, and they will be here. Most of them will be here at the conference, most of them by tomorrow. So, Sharif, do you want to tell? I don't actually know who's on the calls. Do you want to tell me who's on the call? And George, not Ben. Okay, so Jonas Epstein from the U.S. Forest Service, who's been in this conversation quite a few times, is joining us virtually today. His coworker and colleague will be here and is going to come up and chat with us. George Platt, who's got a couple great examples and a lot of good history on this topic, is joining us virtually. He will be here in person later this week. And then Minnie, I never said her last name out loud, Gotzigan, from Colorado State Land Boards, is also going to be here, and she presents later this week with Devlin and Michelle on mitigation on public land. So those folks are virtual, so Sharif's monitoring the comments, so if they have something, they will contribute, and if not, they're at least absorbing things. And with that, I'm gonna make everybody else come up here and hang out with me. So Michelle Matson from the Army Corps of Engineers, Devlin Mead from the BLM, Jessica Barnes from the U.S. Forest Service, Hal Holland from Westervelt, is Greg here? I only got so many. Oh, good. Greg Kernan from Ducks Unlimited, Josh White, George Kelly, and I don't think Steve Martin made it into the room, but if Steve's around, we will drag him up here. So you don't have to sit behind a table because tables feel very formal. So we're just gonna bring your chair, and we're just gonna come up, and we're gonna hang out, and I'm gonna ask you guys questions. And we have some mics, and that's it, really. Here. Devlin is formal.
I feel formal today.
Devlin is in a formal mode. Michelle, are you formal or casual? What are you feeling? Okay. Yeah. Here, I'll put here, George. You can steal this chair if you want. Oh, Steve is here. Who should release it? So wanted to see if anybody had any thoughts on that. Especially, I will put the caveat in that we are interested in getting this out in short order, so we don't want to go down a path that requires a massive amount of agency review and input. So Colorado State University's been involved in this conversation. That was one thought. At some point, someone mentioned the Nature Conservancy. They have not been necessarily involved in the conversation, and so that might take a little more work. We talked about potentially releasing it basically on Ribbits with kind of an acknowledgement of who the primary authors and reviewers have been to date. But yeah, I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that. This is me making my life easier by you telling me what we should do.
Looking to the audience?
I don't know, anybody? Yes. Anybody, folks, up here or in the audience?
I'll start.
Okay.
It would be nice if it came out from, multiple federal agencies as a team, but that could take years to get through the review and approval process. So even one federal agency would be difficult. Not saying we can't do it, but just a cautionary note.
Yeah, and Michelle, we talked about the potential for IWR as an entity under the Corps, but not a formal Corps document.
Right. So we could propose a white paper that comes out of IWR with partners. We've done that before on many topics. Because this affects regulatory, we would definitely need to send it through regulatory for review and, just to gather feedback. But we do have separate funding to do that, if that's the determination.
Lindsay, you remember long ago we had the CEQ, all the great policies that then promoted. It wasn't regulatory in nature, but it kind of outlined a process and approach, of which, of course, got nixed in 2020. But maybe the CEQ would be a good place.
All right. I like that. And I just realized I totally forgot my actual first step, which was introductions. So, given that the microphone's down there, and maybe we could just start with Steve, would you guys mind introducing yourself, who you are, who you work for, and if you wouldn't mind sharing, and I don't remember, Steve, when you walked in the room, but I'd asked everybody to share why you do what you do outside of a paycheck. You know, why are you in the work that you chose to do?
Steve Martin. I'm a retired federal employee. I've worked in the compensatory mitigation space since 1995. Since then, I've been having a lot of fun working the private sector, some volunteering, some working with ILFs, with mitigation bank sponsors, with consultants. And as far as public lands are concerned, I see them as a tremendous opportunity. And I think in everything that Lindsay has presented so far, there is one public land opportunity that has been neglected. And that's subtidal or subaqueous lands, which are typically, they fall under the responsibility of state government. A lot of those, in fact, have, particularly in the East, over years of industrialization, have been contaminated. So you're looking at the potential for lands in the public sphere that may have potential for restoration that would have tremendous ecological benefits. Greg, you're last. I get to give this to you.
Perfect timing. If you need to go to the restroom, it's an expedition from here, so start now.
Greg,
Greg
there's another chair over here if
Kernahan
you wanna
with
sit down.
Ducks Unlimited. I've been directing our mitigation and ecosystem service programs for about the last 10 years, mostly in our Great Plains region, which is 7 states in the North Plains. We have worked on public lands. We have a mitigation site on North Dakota State Land Board property. Been working on that for about 6 years or so, and that's just to get the contract negotiated. So really great site. It's finally built and operating, but it took a long time to get that done. And we've worked with Deblin, had a lot of conversations with Deblin and different members of the Bureau of Land Management on how to establish banks and in-lieu fee projects on their properties as well.
Afternoon, George Kelly. I'm with Earth Recovery Partners. I know it says Quantified
sorry,
Ventures. That's okay. This is my 5th chapter in this space. I started as an environmental attorney, was a partner in a law firm before starting a mitigation enterprise in 1997. And thanks to folks like Steve Martin and Deblin Mead, who were around in those days in this space, supporting good policy, we were able to kind of move in a really good direction in this industry. So after 26 years and KKR buying my interest in Resource Environmental Solutions, which acquired my company, it started as a company of about 2 people. So for those who are on the cottage side, there's real opportunities in this game. So this chapter of my life, I'm helping others, enterprises and projects, to learn from the scars that we've had, whether it's policy, finance, or otherwise. And for me, what drove me is I grew up in a rabble-rousing household from day one, licking stamps for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. The environmental ethic was in me from day one. We don't have time, as Lindsay said, we don't have time to lose. This is, existential. I think we're in the greatest business ever. Because every day when you wake up and you look at a mitigation project or a mitigation bank and you think about what you've done, you're not creating another mall or a parking lot. You're creating an amazing resource with private money. So that's what's driven me. From the public land perspective, we have worked on a number of public lands and also helped on policy. And what's amazing to me is that I was up in Canada on their crown lands, and they have a policy that says they can extract, they can timber, but they can't preserve or restore under law. And you're like, we need these alternative land use dynamics, which have much more value than a lot of the resources that we tend to extract. So it's a policy dynamic and obviously an existential threat.
Everybody, I'm Michelle Matson. I'm Michelle Matson with the Institute for Water Resources, Army Corps of Engineers in Virginia. I am in this and have always been in this career for ecological restoration and was, got involved in regulatory and compensatory mitigation at the beginning of my career because I was 24, 25 years ago, because I was hired by chance by past regulators in the private sector that had gone from the core LA district to the private sector. And so I do regulatory in order to do compensatory mitigation because that's ecosystem restoration at its, if you do it right. With respect to getting into the public land space, because most of my work was done in the arid West, in Southern California in particular, and Arizona, all of the headwaters of those coastal watersheds are on public lands, Cleveland National Forest, Angeles National Forest, et cetera. Very difficult if you are a hard and fast classic stream ecosystem restoration person and do not want to restore rivers where there is arundo, tamarisk, and agriculture and whatnot upstream that is going to adversely affect your restoration. So had started doing, pushing for restoration on public lands as a consultant and as a regulator in California, and then coming to IWR able to help in this process. And I just think it's important in order for us to get the best restoration that we can, whether it's compensatory mitigation or otherwise.
I'm mic'd up, so I know.
Yeah, you can hold it. Now, Scott. Oh, no, you can go.
Go next?
Sorry, yes, you go.
Yeah, so I'm Devlin Mead. I'm with the Bureau of Land Management, and I've been with BLM for maybe six and a half years now, but before that I had about a 20-year career at Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'm not sure when my love of conservation started, but probably pretty early. My first job with Fish and Wildlife Service was as an entomologist, and so I thought, wow, I'm going to get to work with bugs. Not so much. I was assigned a lot of Section 7s, biological opinions to do, and some HCP work, but they quickly, within 3 months, put a mitigation hat on me, a mitigation banking hat, which was the best thing that happened because then I got to work with all of you. So yeah, this has been great. I love the industry. I love the idea of banking, and now that I'm with BLM, we manage a lot of surface lands, public lands. I mean, if you saw the pie chart that went by really fast, 240 million acres, or more, over 240 million acres. We're the biggest land manager, mostly in the West. It's mostly in the West, and then Forest Service comes next. But in the spirit of what Lindsay said, her words like talking about hurdles and what do the solutions look like, I think that's where our agency has been going for the last few years. We are really trying to roll out the red carpet for this industry to come in and do banking or other restoration projects on BLM managed lands. And so, we're making little incremental steps with policy and whatnot. We just published in the Federal Register a proposed rule. It's been dubbed the Public Lands Rule, but it's the Conservation and Land Health proposed rule. And I would really encourage you guys to read that and comment on it. There's some really interesting things in there, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the week. And we have on the policy roundtable on the last day, our BLM coming in to talk about that as well, more specifically. But anyway, yeah, I guess that's why I'm here. I could go on for an hour, but let's move along to our other panelists up here.
It's good stuff. Hal, you're...
I'm Hal Holland. I'm the Western Region Director for Westerville Ecological Services. And I clearly didn't get the memo that this was casual, so
I think you look pretty
in the
casual.
opposite direction. But I do have my camping socks on.
Yes,
So,
I did. I just noticed that.
and I think that ties into, I've spent my entire life backpacking and camping in the national forests, national parks. But what I do with Westerville Ecological Services, we're a mitigation banking firm. I've been doing banking for 20 years, and I've been with Westerville for 17. When we started, we were mitigation and conservation banking, and there was a really strong bias that that was the way to get things done from the private sector. But over the past 15 years, we've gone through pretty much every other form of implementation of mitigation. We've worked with in lieu fees. When the 2008 rule came out, there was a lot of animosity from the banking side against in lieu fees, but we've worked in developing in lieu fees, and we've worked with implementing in lieu fees. We've had a lot of pushback against the effectiveness of HCPs, but we've become an HCP provider in specific locations. We work with land trusts on implementing mitigation projects on lands that are owned by nonprofits. And I'm in California. It is really difficult with as many state and federal agencies as we have with overlapping jurisdiction, trying to figure out how you can do mitigation on public lands just because of the complexity of the long-term assurances or competing interests. But our nature has been, we've really looked at how can we find every mechanism to implement conservation. And Lindsay, to your question, I love being on the private industry side because we can be really quick and nimble with acquiring land. We can be really efficient in actually getting mitigation implemented. And so I just see this as another tool. So I'm really excited to see how this conversation advances because, especially if you saw on the map, California has a huge amount of land that's in private ownership or public ownership. And so finding a way to open that toolkit up for more conservation is going to be really valuable.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Barnes. I'm a national level social scientist with the Forest Service. I'm pretty new to this space, so Jonas Epstein has been contributing here for a while, and I happen to live in Jacksonville, so came in his stead this year. So I am inside of a new policy office in the Forest Service, and we are doing what Lindsay had up on the slide earlier in like the third bucket, developing policy right now for the Forest Service related to mitigation broadly and then compensatory mitigation specifically. As a social scientist, I was brought in to think about some of the social impacts of that policy, particularly with the current administration. There's an interest in thinking about equitable distribution of ecosystem services from compensatory mitigation and ensuring that we're paying attention to that without redistributing services across the landscape as we engage in compensatory mitigation. I was a research scientist at Virginia Tech for a couple of years before switching over to the Forest Service and worked on some projects thinking about the application of things like no net loss policies to grassland bird habitat, borrowing from the lessons that have been learned in wetland mitigation. So I had some exposure to compensatory mitigation before the Forest Service, but I feel like I'm pretty new in this space, and we're just trying to get it right, like Devlin, trying to make sure that we bake into our policy things that really facilitate restoration of NFS lands when those funds are limited from the government, but also do our job to protect those lands and serve the people that are there. And then with your big picture question, Lindsay, about why I do what I do, I feel like the Forest Service is a place where the rubber meets the road in trying to manage multiple uses and different expectations and interests in land. And I've always had this double love from college. I have a biology major, had a sociology major, and then carried it through grad school in people and plants, and I don't know which one I like more, but trying to protect the interests of both. That's why I do what I do and why I'm here. Mostly to learn from all of you. So,
Josh White with Water and Land Solutions. Basically, I was a consultant for almost 20 years, and kind of how Hal was saying, like it's a lot quicker and faster and easier to get these ecosystem restoration projects in there using some of our private money that we have. So that's where I joined Water and Land Solutions. I was already doing mitigation banking as a consultant. It just made it a lot easier. I don't have to go after RFPs. I don't have to do utilization and all that kind of great stuff that I have to worry about. But Water and Land Solutions, we basically do banks on private and public lands. We do have a couple mitigation banks that have been started or have been implemented, and hopefully probably next year we'll probably have something, a couple presentations for that. As for myself, I grew up in Kentucky on a small horse farm, hobby horse farm, camping all over the surrounding states, and I played in the creeks. And I was finding all kinds of bugs and why is this? Why are these fossils in the rocks here? I'm a geomorphologist by trade, but I was always fascinated by streams and wetlands at an early age, even just riding my horse in other states. Why is this rock this way or these soils this way? And so that's kind of where I started getting into that. And then I got into college and took geology classes, and I said, this is it. You know, this is where I want to be. And then I was able to just kind of move along there and show my passion through school. And that's how I kind of got into the whole thing with a job after that. So.
That's awesome. Well, thank you guys all for sharing and for being here. I'd like to tell you I invited them all 6 months ago, but I might not have. It might have just been a week or so ago. So the fact that they all came to join this conversation I'm really grateful for that. So with that, I can ask questions. I can ask questions all day, but I wanted to see if anybody in the audience has any questions that they'd like to, put out for discussion, or any thoughts that you'd like to share and see what other folks are thinking. Yes, Sharif, do you have a microphone, or are we just talking loud? It's Vinny, right? Vinny and I became best friends last night at dinner. Yeah.
So if this is on public lands and BLM, the Forest Service, who is the long-term steward, and how does that all play in? If you're going to do a bank.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I have a feeling it might be a different answer depending on who the public land owner is. So Devlin, I'm wondering if, since it started from the BLM kind of federal side, if you want to speak to that a little bit, and then I'm curious if other folks, I have a local example, but I'd like to hear what other folks think.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So I don't like to think of BLM as an owner. I mean,
yeah, sorry, I couldn't think of the right word.
It's the American people, they're public lands, but manager. And it depends on what the restoration project is. So is it a bank? Is it just a restoration project? What are the details in whatever the instrument, the instrument is, the banking instrument or whatever, on, at what point does the sponsor, that's doing the restoration project stop, and maybe BLM starts, if at all. I mean, it could be set up exactly as a bank on private lands with an endowment fund that's supposed to be funding the long-term stewardship in perpetuity, with an entity, qualified entity, third party, not BLM, holding that money and ensuring that gets done, with BLM having some oversight. So that might be one possible way. We haven't done these yet. I mean, we really want to get started doing these. We've had a few bank proposals. We're going to see how those work out. But it's also possible if the mitigation project is restoration project is completely sustainable after 20 years and everything's looking fine, and it can just be folded into BLM's management regime, maybe that too. And I know that brings up a lot of issues on, competition or costs, versus public and private land. But I mean, it's going to depend.
I mean, there could be competing uses between what BLM would allow on the land and what a mitigation bank might allow on the land.
Yeah, and we, by law and under, and for BLM, we are essentially, we need to make sure that we are administering the Federal Land Policy and Management Act as it's written. And in that case, we usually cannot exclude recreation, more passive cost, recreation. We probably can restrict shooting or things like that. Sometimes we're not going to be able to restrict grazing, especially if there's already a grazing lease in place. We're going to have to figure out how that works. It's compatible, but yeah, there's some things we can't exclude, but other uses that we can.
And some of those things can be taken care of up front. I mean, if there's grazing, like, okay, maybe that's not the right location or whatever.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm curious,
Forest Service?
Yeah, I was curious if you had any thoughts on that, Jessica?
Yeah, I think much of what Devlin said applies to the Forest Service as well. We manage for multiple uses. Our policy is in development as we speak. So currently we're really lean into the structure that's provided by land management plans that apply to all National Forest System lands, and they're managed as this mosaic of uses, right? You can do this here and this here and this here, and some areas exclude certain uses. The policy currently leans into the designation of a responsible party who's responsible for that mitigation project through its end. And then, of course, we have language about durability through the duration of the impacts from the land use. So I think, like what Devlin said, it's going to be wrapped up in the specific authorization. I don't think we have many examples of it being done yet. But yeah, it's going to lean into who's responsible and then the land management plan in terms of those competing uses, if that helps at all.
I'm wondering, kind of down the same path, if, Devlin, you were talking about, I'm not necessarily getting rolled into existing BLM management, but let's say BLM was for a project being considered for the long-term manager, same thing for Forest Service. I know there's been conversations about, different entities have different options for receiving funds and or hurdles for receiving funds. So there's often a connection between these different hurdles. And so I'm wondering if the Forest Service has, I know they haven't solved it, but do you envision that the solution is identifying the path for receiving funding, or that the solution is using a third-party entity more likely, or both, I guess, but.
Yeah, good question. I don't think we know, and I specifically don't know. This is where we want to phone our friend Jonas if he's on the line. He would have a better sense of those agreements and what's required. I know one thing he talks about is that we don't have a special use authorization code currently that allows like permanent change to the land, or certainly that's not allowed, and then that holding of funds and how to receive them. So I don't know.
Yeah.
If I'm answering your question.
I'm wondering, Jonas, if you're here in space.
Are you there?
I'm wondering, one of my questions is there anything precluding a third-party long-term manager on Forest Service? Like, is that an immediate option as opposed to the receiving funds? So I don't know what Jonas says. I'll let Sharif.
Yeah, Jonas had some input for the previous question. Oh, you want to go first?
Just a different perspective.
Yeah.
I'm working with an in lieu fee program that has implemented mitigation projects in contaminated subtidal, subaqueous lands. Those are state-owned lands. The in lieu fee program takes on the responsibility, the obligation for long-term management, and in part paid for through the mitigation fees they take in. So in that situation, the state is the landowner. The in lieu fee program is responsible for long-term management.
And that then allows that decoupling of
Yes.
a state entity trying to
Yes.
figure out how to take the funds in. Awesome. Hal, you had more on that, and then we'll go to Sharif.
Sure. Mine is not a direct answer to this, but we were doing mitigation where we were doing mitigation where we were looking to take land that we had acquired and give it to a federal refuge, and it never got to fruition because we couldn't get the state and federal agencies to agree on it, but we got really close, and so we had gone through a lot of that process. They had already done mitigation work on the refuge previously, and so they were going to be the long-term manager, but they have collected funds in the past that they gave to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to hold, and then they would get that money allocated back on an annual basis and then hire out subconsultants or contractors to do the work. So that's at least on the refuge system, how they had found success.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'm going to interrupt for a minute because a couple of federal agencies were kind of left off your slide up there.
Oh, yeah,
Fish
no,
and
those were,
Wildlife
yeah.
Service and the refuges. National Park Service has a lot of lands, and there have been restoration projects, I think, for mitigation purposes done on national park lands. I don't know if we have anybody here from
No,
the
but I
National
know
Park
they're
Service.
not unless somebody showed up. But Kevin, I know, isn't going to be here, but we did have a conversation with him. And so the National Park Service has been continuing to work through some internal policies that, until it's until it's there, it's not going to be kind of shared, but they definitely have done a lot of evaluation of the degraded lands within the national park system to quantify and describe the need and the justification for mitigation. So yeah, it's a good question to follow up on. And Sharif, you said Jonas had some.
Yeah, Jonas had some input. I think you guys have pretty much covered it, but he did say that they haven't yet determined whether the U.S. Forest Service wants to administer their own banks. He generally thinks they're better off relying on third-party sponsors, given internal capacity issues. There would be a lot of hurdles they'd have to clear if the U.S. Forest Service were to become their own sponsor for projects. They attempted to do so once in Minnesota, but had no legal mechanism to generate revenue from credits. So in addition to modifying their internal authorities, it would be in their best interest to ensure the outcomes that they're adhering to are consistent with what a permit would have to demonstrate in the same service area.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this, at the end of the day, the goal is for this to walk and talk just like any other mitigation project. So those assurances and securities need to be held up. And so unless an agency, a land manager is in a position to be able to kind of provide that assurance of staff of responsibility, that third-party entity, in the same way that it's often used in private mitigation banking or on private lands, might still be the best solution. But hopefully one of the things that you guys, as we continue to talk today, you'll hear is a lot of different choices, because there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for any one of these. And so, when we were talking the other day with Jonas and Jessica, we were talking about even within their own policy that the Forest Service is working on is trying to identify options, and I think that's one of the things we're hoping that both comes out of the white paper, but in particular comes out of case studies, so that we can be able to demonstrate, this worked here, maybe you can try this. This worked here, maybe you can try that. So I think this is a good example of that. George?
Yeah, I think Steve just raised a good point about the policy as we look at this. There tends to be a heavy federal lens, but there's so many state, county, local lands. Some of the first mitigation banks in Florida were on county lands. And if George Platt's on, he could give us more insights on that. But I think, to your point, Lindsay, which is it's going to be the eye of the beholder relative to the ownership of that. The other thing is the question about, is it only mitigation? Are we looking at water quality, water rights, carbon? Is this, how far, resiliency, how far do we want to look at this? Because I think you would hope that you create a template that allows third party, that it applies to any of those markets.
Agreed.
But I think that's, Steve raised a good point on the other ownership.
Yeah, and my one example that I was going to mention is a local city of Chula Vista in South San Diego County, where we're working on a mitigation bank. They are, the land manager, title holder of the land. It's already preserved, but they will also be the long-term manager. Not so much because that's what every local land manager wants to do, but because they already are operating a preserve system, so they already have standard mechanisms for bringing on consultants to run their preserve system, and so they're in a place and a capacity to demonstrate their ability to implement long-term monitoring and protection of resources. So we've gone through that process of working with the resource agencies and with the city to document what that looks like. But that goes back to that additionality, where we had to definitely document what's already part of their current job description and what's not part of their job description, both geographically and actual activities, and then how do they receive those funds. It's, it's different than just dumping more funds in the preserve system. Those funds need to be set aside for that mitigation project, because there's always unknowns in the world of, public funding. So those, once again, having those kinds of examples so we can demonstrate, well, why did it work like that here versus why didn't it work like that somewhere else? So yeah, I think that's going to be our biggest action item coming up, is really to pull out more and more of the case studies, both what works and doesn't work. I'm a big fan of the, if only everybody published their science that didn't work, we'd probably not try it again, because someone already tried it, it didn't work. So yeah. Any questions from or other questions from the audience? Right behind you.
I've got one. I'm Dr. Robert Keller. Before I became the punching bag for the IRS, I used to be a conservation biologist. I attended a climate change symposium in 2009, and Herman Daly, who recently passed away, said that if we're getting ready to jump out of an airplane, shouldn't we at least craft a crude parachute as opposed to worrying about altimeters and all sorts of scientific devices? And I think what he was trying to say is we've got to address things and we've got to do it quickly. And I was just talking with Joe back here in regards to when do we get to the point where we go for a all of the above solution? Because everybody, I just attended an agrivoltaics conference in Chicago, which was enlightening because everybody was still naive and they thought we were going to be able to make a difference without the caliber and the governorship of trying to address climate change. But when do we basically go past the U.S. Forest Service and Westerveld? You guys have done such a great job in regards to ecosystem services. But when do we sit there and get past we've got some type of regulation over here and the Forest Service can't do it, BLM can't do it. But when do we finally address that? We got to jump out of an airplane here, guys. We've got to do something. And all of the above, and that term additionality, I hate that term. Because why can't we just do it all? So that's one thing I'd like to throw to you guys, and I know you've been regulatory to death, as my friend Joe has. But when do we basically set aside habeas corpus like Abraham Lincoln did and go, we got to go, we got to go, we got to go? Thank you.
It's a great question, and I'm going to guess it's one that none of us are capable of answering. But I completely hear you and completely, I think that's one of the reasons why we've continued to want to do this is to be able to provide the answers to the skeptic of like, well, we can't do this because of this, and we can't do this because of this. So like, I like to think of myself as a specialist in not accepting no, like that there is literally no such thing. Like I'm sure some of you've had wonderful calls with your phone provider where they're like, I just can't give you that discount. Why can't you? The computer won't let me. And I'm like, that is so I am that person who will be like, that is literally impossible. There's always a human. If I have to talk to the person at the top, somewhere there is an answer, somewhere there is a yes. And so I think one of the exercises that we're really trying to get to is at least get to the yes. I don't know about habeas corpus and like, that's a whole other philosophical place that the human population has to get to somehow that I don't know what that looks like. But I agree completely. The goal is to move quickly, and I appreciated what Hal said about why both as a consultant but also as a banker, we are in this unique position to make things happen quickly. But I will maybe look at, there's not a lot of regulators up here. There's Michelle and then bonus Steve. Yeah, what do you think,
I
Michelle?
say now. I totally agree with you. When is the time? Now. And I think, the white paper is just to put out, here's how you deal with this question or theoretical concern of additionality and of, site protection, longevity, et cetera. So that, from my perspective, so that regulators can look at it like it's not going to be a guidance, but look at it like they do a guidance that says, oh, wait, the rule does allow this. Because early on in the conversation, at least my portion of the conversation 6-7 years ago, it was, well, what about? And regulators are trained to be risk averse because everything that is not just issuing a simple nationwide permit or individual permit or whatever goes to the attorney, right? And almost all things related to compensatory mitigation, whether it be a bank or PRM, conservation easements and whatnot, at least in LA District, go through the attorney. Is it efficient? Absolutely not. But they are risk averse, number one. Number two, I see, no offense, wildlife agencies. The wildlife agencies want to collect data. They love the data. What's going to be the impact on this species, that species, da-da-da. And we had a lot of arguments in the period of time I was in LA between 2008 and 2013 on getting coastal restoration projects done, implemented, and stop asking the questions over and over and over. It was, let's collect more data. Let's collect more data. There were 10 plus years of data being collected on coastal wetlands in San Diego County before anything ever moved dirt. And that was dumb, waste of time. I agree with you. I think we need to move forward and allow for adaptive management. Have enough funding put in place for adaptive management, and I know that term is like all-encompassing, and long-term management so that we can correct errors. But you have to do that regardless of what you do. We can all pretend like we know how to do ecosystem restoration, but we are not Mother Nature, and things change, and fires happen, and floods happen, and hurricanes happen where they never did before. So I think you're right. I think we need to get past this idea that we have to have all the answers before we move out, and as regulators, be flexible in your permits, have those conditions that require the funding, and that allow you to work with them for adaptive management. And so that's kind of what we're doing more so for coastal resources because of sea level rise. You have to, right? Because you're going to have to be managing the elevation of those wetlands over time unless you want them all to be open water. But if we keep asking questions, we're not going to have anything to restore. That's very negative. I didn't mean that exactly.
I was just going to ask Jonas if he's still on. We were working on a mitigation template like 10 years ago. Hadn't moved that much, and we're still in draft form. And it's not necessarily the Forest Service fault. There's a lot of issues with COVID, change of administration, loss of direction. But I'm just curious about, we were trying to build templates 10 years ago. We've been answering these questions since 2005, and we still haven't moved at all. And I think that this goes to somebody like Devlin. If you've got a champion that understands a policy direction that can change how an agency works, that's so essential. To me, it's about policy and also champions. And I'm so glad, Devlin, you're at BLM.
Yeah, thank you. And while we're waiting for hopefully Jonas to respond.
I think Sheree.
You do have a response?
Oh, I think we now have audio.
I think we're getting there with regards to
Oh.
carbon water markup.
That's Jonas.
On National Forest System land, but we get waylaid by process. The tack I've been trying to push is to provide top-level cover for some trial and error through pilot efforts while encouraging this group here at this conference to reach out to Congress and by associated properties and the department heads to prioritize it. We're in a phase we're moving into pilot testing of new agreement types, hopefully, the pilot testing of new registry cleared methodologies, but we need to elevate the status internally, and without agency prioritization, it is and it always will remain a coalition of the willing, at least in our agency, without some leadership coverage and some staff positions. It was really good foresight of the BLM to hire somebody like Devlin, but we don't have an analogous position in our agency. We're starting to work more with the Corps. We want to develop an MOU of which, like George mentioned, we already had template guidance, but the Corps has its own process for getting folks to sign off on that. It has to go through the Department of the Army, and the Corps hasn't elevated this to the point where they feel it's that priority level right now, and so it'll require some redirection of staff time. That's unfortunately it's the bureaucratic process that gets in the way. So I mean, from my position, I think having this mitigation policy that Jessica was referring to is a real step in the right direction. We're already going through tribal consultation. We're already putting it out for internal review. So I think we're going to get there sooner rather than later. And I think there's some real legs to that movement. We're circulating the template agreements to get some revision and review and hopefully get it into a place where the Army Corps and the Forest Service can post that guidance within the year. But it just takes time without it being a priority.
I like what Jonas said about the coalition of the willing, which is really, once again, why we host this session and invite you all to join, because until someone actually moves the hurdles out of the way and just lets us roll forward and do good work, the hurdles remain, and it takes people willing to just keep pushing and not accepting no and finding solutions. So, Greg, I know you had some thoughts and then Devlin will come back to you.
Yeah, I was just going to talk from our experience, everything from the governing laws to the regulations to the policies to the people are the kinds of things that are keeping us from being really successful on public lands. It's not just a matter of saying, hey, we've got this new policy that says we'd really like to do more mitigation on public lands. That's more of a virtue signal than anything else. what we really need are people that are willing to go in and make sure that the laws work so that we can take the resources that are available to us, use them in place, and restore these degraded lands. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And so until we see some more willingness to do that, I think that we'll continue to see that private land is the premier alternative to providing these services. So I think it's more so, really starting at the top and thinking about how all of these different issues really prevent us from being successful on public lands. One of the issues that we came across was grazing allotments. If you've got a grazing allotment, you're probably not going to have a lot of success getting a project on that property. And there's laws in place that prevent the grazer, the allottee, I think they're called, from being able to say, yeah, I'd give up some grazing, or I would change my grazing rights, because they are written in law as to how they have to be implemented. So there's a lot of work that has to go into accomplishing these goals, and I think that's something that this group should really focus on and think about, what levels of change can we really affect in a relatively quick time frame.
Actually, Greg, I wanted to just mention Sarah's not with us, Executive Director for IRBA, because she's flying here right now, but we did talk about this, and I know that this topic has been raised further up within IRBA, so I'm hoping that we will start seeing and be able to work this from multiple directions. So I think that's one of the other answers, is if we just keep coming at it from different places and really kind of trying to be a champion for this topic and the topic of mitigation in general, right? I mean, there are plenty of hurdles even on private lands to actually getting something through the process. So, but yeah, I did want to mention that for those of you that are members of IRBA or participating in that I think this will start becoming a part of the conversation more regularly. Steve, did you have a thought, or were you just holding the mic?
Basically, in a different way, echoing what Greg said. Too often, the focus is on doctrinaire following the requirements. Oh, I've got to provide site protection. Oh, it's got to be a conservation easement. No, it's on public land. So what other mechanisms can you look at? You can't record something on the deed, but what about an agreement between the landowner and the party that wants to do the restoration work and perhaps the regulatory authorities? That might provide the highest level, highest degree of protection, and it allows you to move forward with more innovative projects on public lands.
Josh,
I was just going to piggyback on Greg when he talked about timelines. Working with more of a public entity, usually it takes a lot of time to get through all the agreements, or at least your first agreement. And there's one that we have right now that it's 2 years in the making versus something that you might have a landowner in a month, a private landowner. So, in that one with the 2 year, basically we're kind of moving on. We found another site. When they come back and decide, we'll say, all right, well, we have this option agreement with you. We might not implement it for another 2 or 3 years because we have to do this other mitigation bank before that. But in other instances, once we kind of have like an MOU, MOA with that kind of entity, it moves a lot quicker with that second or third project. So.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think that it's something to state that we're not talking about this because we think it's really easy, or, I don't think mitigation on public lands is necessarily for the faint of heart, but I do think, which is why we spent time at the beginning talking about why we think access to these lands and doing this work is still so important, that under the right circumstances, and I know when Nate was here last year in the room, he was talking about, that the revenue scenario or the business scenario might also look different. This is not necessarily, there's a lot of different perspectives, I think, about, how much money that the revenue should be a lot higher because you're not paying for the land. And at least I will speak from my project's perspective that is not the case. For my projects in Southern California, the request from the land manager was to offset the use of the land by design implementation of a trail system, permitting the whole thing. And so there was a process to evaluate the land, and those services were then provided to offset the use And so, and on top of that, it's an interesting project, but most recently I've started realizing that this is a project that would never happen if it wasn't being done by a private entity. Because of the cost, it's also in an area that's overlapping with a historical defense site, and the hurdles that the project has to go through could only really be funded by a private entity with the right drivers. Grant funding, the timeline associated with trying to clear some of the hurdles that you might face on public lands, it's another reason why those private dollars and these private-public partnerships can be so powerful, is you sometimes have the opportunity to get in and solve problems that otherwise will just stay there. I saw a hand go up, and I feel like I saw something in my periphery. Yes.
I was just going to say the cost of NEPA can definitely be expensive when you're on public lands. And somewhat, I don't know, the cost of NEPA versus land cost, NEPA can get very expensive.
Yeah, that's a good point. Two hands. I think we're going to get microphones. There's kind of three hands. We're going to go dead middle for first hand.
So you just mentioned a project that you said probably couldn't have been done without private investment.
Correct.
How do you, or we collectively, and I'm new to this conversation, so forgive me if this has been covered in previous years, but how do we make sure that those are the types of mitigation projects that are being put out there for public lands, and not just work that would have been done by these land management agencies anyway, and those projects might accidentally redirect funding from other restoration initiatives onto public land that could be restored through another funding mechanism?
Yeah, so I think that one is that's a good question, and one that doesn't have a simple answer, but I do think that comes back to kind of the procedures for good mitigation in the first place, that ideally, as we work through the policies to offset impacts, we're looking for the most appropriate mitigation, be it conservation, aquatic resources, and if it falls on public land, if that's still the best use for the watershed, that's the best place to be doing it, that's where we start to champion for that type of work, as opposed to just kind of cherry picking things here and there. But that's my quick thoughts. Josh?
So there's a lot of times the public lands, when they're restoring those resources, they're going after some sort of grant funding, right? A lot of times when I'm talking to those landowners or the public entities, I ask them, like, how many projects do you have? What are your top priorities? And they might say 1, 2, 3. And I'm like, all right, well, how about we do one of these, and we're going to be paying you back because this is JQ Public. We all bought this piece of property, right? So we're going to pay you that, so you can take some of that money that we're giving you for this project, you use that as part of your match money for that another piece to go down the road, so you can get 2 projects done for the price of 1, essentially.
Yeah. And I have seen that happening in the San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District, who's not here this year, but they've talked a lot about their projects where they use their dollars from the water district perspective, but they use those as grant funding to double the size of the project. So I think that some of that requires us all to operate at a certain standard, that we're doing good work and good projects. I mean, there's always going to be someone out there, being that bad example that we'll just hopefully put over here. But I do think that another thing is just us all holding each other accountable for doing good work. And then obviously having good case studies and examples, and ideally narratives that talk about when it's the right path and when it isn't. And for this project in San Diego, it's already preserved land, but the dollars that they have for that preserved land are already not enough for the preserved land, and the preservation is for upland species only. So there's actually no money set aside to do anything for any of the aquatic resources. So it was the kind of space where you're filling a gap that you can identify. But I do think that comes into the due diligence of evaluating the opportunity in the first place and how.
The only thing I would...
It's just you.
Here we go. The only thing I would add is when we've talked with public sector entities that are looking at doing projects, if they're far enough along that they have funding committed, they can't usually just pivot that to something else. So they want to implement the project that they've secured the funding for. And so I think if you look at it most broadly, if they already have the funding for it, they're going to want to implement it. If they don't have the funding for it, I think that still provides the opportunity that we're looking at, because there is just a abundant shortfall of funding for the types of projects that need to occur that are out there. But then I think we're starting to pivot into the question of additionality of, okay, well, what was the baseline and what's the actual lift? Because that's where you start to get the offset of, are you going to draw people to just doing work on public lands because it's cheaper than if you had to pay for the cost of the land? And so that's why there is some value in figuring out what the additionality is.
Yeah, and also I think that that concept of it being cheaper is something that under certain circumstances that might be the case. In other circumstances, it might actually be the opposite depending on what you're doing. But you know, we were talking to a land manager recently, and one of their reasons for considering pursuing mitigation on their land as opposed to just a grant funding for a restoration project, because they have their eyes on something, they have their number one. But if they pursue the grant funding, and grant funding is literally being thrown at them, like it's the kind of project where they're like, take this money, and they're like, but we don't have any long-term management money. You can't include that in the grant funding. And so if we take your money, we have now removed the ability for us to partner with a private entity to pursue this mitigation opportunity, to not just do the same project that we want to do, but then also to secure long-term funding. On top of that, to potentially do some revenue share back to further their mission, which is, in this case, is a land trust. So like, okay, if we do this and we partner with a private entity, we get additional funds to feed back into our mission, because they're still a nonprofit. They're not suddenly going to become a for-profit entity, but those dollars can go back into their mission to secure buying more property or implementing other projects. So, and at least to, yeah, I'll stop there. But,
Two more questions here.
oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, so.
There's a microphone right next to you. Sorry.
Oh. I've talked with I'm in Montana, and I've talked with the Montana state lands people about the potential of, a while ago, before I was actually working in this field, or in private mitigation. And, I talked about the potential for state lands being, for restoration and for banking the ecosystem services as being an income for the state. And of course, the long-term assurances was a big, the easements, that kind of thing was a big issue there. But I guess I'm wondering, as far as when you're a private mitigation company, you have to make money with the money you're given to invest, or that people are investing in it. But the state lands, their whole point is to make money also. So how do you do that? Is that the same as with a private landowner? With private landowners, they get a portion of profits. Is that how it's done with state? Is that they also get
I don't know.
portion of sales?
I don't know if Mindy's. Yeah, is that Mindy? Yes. So Mindy's Colorado state lands. So let's let Mindy speak.
I'm Mindy Godsagan from the Colorado State Land Board. We have a 10-year program of working with mitigation bankers, and that is precisely what we've done. Is we treat bank sponsors as another one of our kinds of lessees. One thing that I've actually had my hand up, but I just wanted to mention that all public lands obviously are not the same, and state trust lands are kind of a unique kind of public land, mostly in the western United States, but their whole mission is to generate revenue, and so we're very focused on generating revenue. I'm actually I'm not at all interested actually in routine types of projects, because those are set up not to really generate, to not make a profit from mitigation banking. And so we've been working mostly just with private mitigation bank sponsors, and we basically split the revenue, the income that comes from the credits. We offload a lot of our risk onto the mitigation bank sponsors. As a result, we get a little bit less profit than we would if we were fuller partners, but we've structured our projects primarily to generate revenue, and we probably might not even be in this business if we weren't able to do that. And I'll be presenting on Thursday morning if you want to learn more about what we're doing.
Yeah, no, so this is one of the reasons we made the Zoom thing today, because Mindy wasn't going to be here, and in particular, the state lands is a very interesting not alternative, a different type of public land and with a different mission. And so she's going to be, as she mentioned, presenting from 8:30 to 10 on Thursday. And actually Devlin is presenting and Michelle is presenting. So conveniently, the emerging markets has quite a few conversations happening on public lands. But I think it's a good question, and I'd be curious for any of our bankers how do you adjust your business model for those of you that have worked on public lands, or do you go on into it? Yeah, does it look different than working with a private landowner, or is it just a profit share model that you already implement and it doesn't look any different? I don't know.
With us, it depends. It's
Okay.
like every project.
Yeah.
But my one question is does a lot of these public lands that are getting mitigation banks on there, are they receiving some sort of compensation for the land? But the way that we can do that is we can do it like as a revenue share. Sometimes we can also upfront for each one of these banks give you a cash option. When we kind of get our nationwide 27, start digging the dirt. Then another one is amenities at specific parks or something like that. So some of those local ones, if you're doing it right here at this location here in Jacksonville, maybe if you're going to give them money or something like that, it's going to go back up to the state and they'll never see anything. But this park right here needs amenities. It needs a new trail that's beat up, or maybe they need a new trail, or maybe they need a new shelter to bring more people into it and even put up the signage. And one of the things that we put in one of the parks there was a handicap fishing pier, basically. So it can be endless on how that piece of property or the state or the local folks get paid in revenue somehow.
Yeah.
So working on ranch land is the same. I mean, we're paying for fencing and off-site water, tank systems, that kind of thing. And because a lot of the state lands that are the school trust lands are used for grazing, of course, so especially with grazing, we could basically be doing the same thing, improve their water management, that kind of thing, as part of the agreement as well.
Yeah.
It could be very similar.
We usually put a dollar amount up to whatever it is. So because it's kind of like what we would be giving back to a regular private landowner or even the public. Usually we try to just scale those basically the same way. What we're giving to the private landowner, same thing to the public.
Josh, I'm curious, have you gone through kind of an evaluation of land value process for public lands? We had to do this, and it's an interesting exercise since they're not on the market, right? And there is no such thing as them on the market. But how have you gone through the process of valuing the land to get to that not to exceed value?
It's kind of a negotiation back and forth.
Yeah.
They kind of know what the land value is relatively in the area. If it was the same thing, say it's the U.S. Forest Service and they own a bunch of land around there, but what are all those other parcels going for around there? So there's kind of like a market analysis.
Okay, good. That's what we did, so I've just been curious.
But then you kind of have that, and then you're like, all right, well, this is what we're doing, and you guys have the land, you have the resources. Sometimes we even bump it up a little bit more,
right?
Just because of, you have the resources, we wouldn't have it without you. So.
Correct. Yeah, that's great.
This is Mitigation. Again, we actually have an appraisal done of the value of the conservation easement. We also have a minimum amount that we want to be paid back based on that appraisal. So we enter into negotiations with the mitigation bank sponsor, both of what the minimum value of the project we'd like to get back, which would cover the cost of the easement. If all goes bad and they don't sell a single credit, we at least want the value of the diminution in value for the property, and then we do also negotiate the value of the percentage of each credit.
That's awesome.
By state law, we're required to do an appraisal.
No, that's good. And I'm thinking out loud, Mindy, for the white paper and in general, that since you already have a procedure in place, that might be something that's also worth kind of sharing or documenting within the white paper, because that's a kind of continuing conversation is that value evaluation.
Yeah, and for BLM, by law, we have to get fair market value rent for the use of the land. And so how that's determined is different, but in the past, it seems like it's usually been a low amount because these areas are kind of more rural or, agricultural or whatever. So I think in the proposed rule, if you look in there, I think an interesting question we're asking the public to comment on is, how should we value these areas in public land where there are going to be these restoration projects, whether they're conservation oriented or like for mitigation purposes. So I think that's something you might want to think about and comment on.
That's awesome. Yes, Sharif's got a microphone for you.
This question is for Hal and Devlin and anybody else who wants to weigh in. Can dust sourced from BLM and state land be mitigated, to be designed to be mitigated to protect interstate travelers, working with grazing leaseholders, be used as a mitigation bank?
Yeah.
Can dust sourced from BLM and state land, designed to be mitigated to protect interstate travelers, while working with grazing leaseholders, be a potential mitigation bank?
What was that?
Is it the
dust?
control of
like
dust?
DUST?
Yes,
like,
dust.
Like an air quality
Yeah,
kind of issue?
exactly. Mm-hmm.
And are you saying managing the air quality on BLM, on
BLM and state,
on public land? Oh my gosh.
Working with grazing leaseholders that is adjacent to an interstate, be a mitigation bank, and
to offset
potentially working with FHWA or the state DOTs.
I don't have any experience with that. But what I would say is, from a very broad question, which is there's lots of forms of impacts and there's lots of forms of state and federal requirements to minimize or compensate for impacts. You have to have a regulatory threshold that's going to be in place to support banking. So if it's an air quality impact, there's got to be some entity that's actually evaluating that impact and requiring an offset or a compensation for banking to be the tool that you're looking to then use. And so I'm sure you could use grazing control to minimize dust impacts, but from the financial standpoint of getting someone in there to pay for the grazing leaseholders to change their operations or anything else, there's got to be a mechanism whereby it's cheaper to do it that way than it is some other approach. And so that's really the question, is I don't know what the market would be that would support the banking model.
If the DOT comes in or FHWA comes in, could that be the source of funding that could legitimize the bank?
If they're willing to regulate it and assess impacts and require compensation.
Yeah, and for I know that whenever projects come in, if they have air quality impacts, that is something we have to look at. And if it rises to a significant level, through the NEPA analysis, that can and should, result in some mitigation for that. What that would be, I don't know. I don't know if grazing, prescriptive grazing would be, depending on the project, a mitigation measure.
I bet if you brought water back to Owens Valley or Salton Sea, you'd
there you go.
Credit for keeping dust down and expanding the wetlands.
Yeah.
I don't mean to make a joke out of it. It just, I was like, how can you do that?
Yeah. And while we're in the subject of grazing, I'm sorry, cut you off.
Go ahead.
The subject of grazing, so Greg, I know you said that you kind of out of luck with that. California did something pretty innovative, and they're actually able to purchase from an entity that had a BLM grazing lease, the rights for their lease, essentially. And I don't know all the details. I'll have to go look it up. But that was done. It could potentially be done in other states. It is going to be somewhat limited by state law if that would allow that or not. But it's something to, it's not something that is just absolutely not possible.
Never say never.
Yeah, that was my understanding too, is that somehow or other you have to acquire the allotment. So either by purchasing the land itself or purchasing the rights from the landowner. I thought that there was an effort a few years ago at least to change the allotment regulations so that allottees could sell their rights separate from giving up all of their grazing rights, but I don't think that ever went anywhere. That's the kind of stuff that I'm alluding to would be great to tackle and understand some of the nuances for how we can better improve some of the regulations to make sure we can be successful there.
Yeah, and I haven't followed up on that. We can do that. But, you know, in cases where the grazing is going to be compatible with whatever, and the lessee is cooperative and willing to do that, you can have both of those land uses in place, the compensatory mitigation project and the grazing lease.
Well, Greg, you were saying that even if the the grazer was willing to modify practices because they can't actually change the allotment, it doesn't provide that security that will stay in perpetuity. So it wasn't so much just finding a willing entity to change behaviors or practices, it was actually changing the regulations to demonstrate that long-term action, if I understood correctly.
You have to have some sort of right to operate on that allotment.
And I was also curious in what you were saying about purchasing the allotment. Did you ever explore purchasing their right and then giving a portion of it back? I'm just wondering if you are the right holder, could you purchase it so that you have that full authority, but then give a portion back to, I'm just trying to think of.
Yeah, I think these are, yeah, Devlin might know a lot better than I do, for sure.
The leases are usually for 10 years, and then BLM, you know, can renew or not renew them. And so if, you know, and I think as things get, with climate change in some areas where things are getting really dry and not supporting grazing anymore, I think you're going to see non-renewals happen in some of those areas. And then that's, you know, unfortunately that would be a time when things are pretty desperate when you would come in to do a compensatory mitigation project, revegetation, but I mean, it's something to think about.
And Devlin, you raise a great point about the community at large. We're working with a variety of folks in large-scale land grazing dynamics, and one of the things you have to be sensitive to, even if one individual grazing allotment, allotee, says, I'm gonna restrict the use, a lot of their brethren aren't necessarily accepting, and you're really talking about an entire community, an entire infrastructure, the silos and everything else around it, and so there's high sensitivity in dealing with one versus the community at large.
Right, that's a really good point. And you know, if you're going to do something like that, sometimes it's a pilot project, see how it works. Hopefully, you know, it's really successful, and then you can start getting some buy-in from other landowners or land. In this case, it would be grazing lessees.
So we have 5 minutes left, and I'm all about sucking every minute out of our 2 hours together, but I didn't know if anybody else, if there were any other questions. Yeah.
I'm Billy Hackett from Missouri. I just kind of had a question about what happens decades down the road after a site is established successfully and, you know, it's established in perpetuity to serve as for whatever reason it was replacing. What happens when the public land managers down the road either forget there was a mitigation site and then they learn to change their land management practices? Is there any situation where it could prevent the land managers from doing activities that they would like to do on the land, or limitations and, you know, say the regulations change and they have to change park management for whatever reason? Does it prevent or make it more difficult for them to do those things in the future, given that replacing a mitigation site is generally more expensive than the initial impact in the first place? I have an example in southern Missouri. We had a conservation site that was originally established as a big wetland mitigation site. The Conservation Department took it on, and at some point over that 30-year period, it was established in the 90s, which is kind of cool to see it grow in satellite imagery. But one part of it they converted from like an emergent wetland to more of like a moist soil management basin. And later on, we actually had to go back and look at it, for a weird story with that. And we found that out. We're like, oh, and we had to talk to the park about it. And at first, they were like, well, you can't tell us how to manage our land. And then, after they saw the documentation, they kind of begrudgingly turned it back into the emergent wetland. I just imagine a scenario where that's scaled up that concern before it ever becomes a concern, or to make sure that the land managers that accept mitigation on their land know the risks that they're taking? And could that compound cost issues in the future? So if they're already struggling to do some of their backlog items, and then that becomes a new backlog item 50 years down the road that's more expensive, does it compound those kind of issues as well?
Yeah, that's, so I think your question in general is a question that I always have, just not even just about public land, even private land, just like how in 60 years does somebody remember that that's actually something we're not supposed to pave over? And I'm slightly skeptical that I don't know the answer to that. You know, we're in the world of technology, so I guess at least compared to maybe the 90s when it started, we're not having to find that document that's shoved on someone's shelf that retired and it's in their garage. Now we have that technology, but I mean, I do think that's one of the tough parts about mitigation on public land in general is documenting that protection in perpetuity, and it can't necessarily be a deed restriction. And so how do you do that, which is where we're trying to provide a variety of choices, which could include MOUs and MOAs. But how you make sure the next person knows what the previous person was aware of is I don't actually, yeah.
Also, just another layer is putting the burden on the public rather than the impact. So the initial site would be like the impactor had to pay for the site, but then in the future, any changes in the future, the public would be on the hook for replacing those resources.
Well, and that's where the long-term endowments, I mean, I think what you're describing is a risk that's built in to every mitigation project and has to be accounted for in long-term funding, endowments, reporting, all of that. But, you know, I don't know if that's if any of the regulators or
the public lands rule kind of touches, that proposed public lands rule touches on that issue. And like once it's a mitigation site, you know, what does that mean in, you know, in the future? And it does become more valuable once it's restored as a conservation area. Like, you know, other areas for BLM, we have the ACECs, the areas of critical environmental concern, which have more protection. Maybe it gets incorporated into a category of lands with wilderness characteristics, or even wilderness, or something like that. So that's something also. Take a read, and you know, it'd be really good to hear your comments on that.
Yeah.
I've got like a penny's worth of thought on this. I think you ask a question that's valid for anything. I mean, I've gone past we have a mitigation bank, and as we were driving out to our mitigation bank, we drove past a vernal pool site that one of my colleagues had worked on, that a new landowner had come in and they had planted pistachios across the whole thing. And we had to call the Army Corps to be like, hey, there's an easement on that property, and the easement holder wasn't looking into it, and they eventually went after that landowner and had them pull the trees out of the vernal pools at least. But I think you can have this with anything, but something that came up in the earlier session, someone asked, what do you do when banks fail? And I would say, I don't think that there's a lot of cases where banks fail. It's usually like partial failures, small incremental decreases. And I think you could get that on public or private lands. What I think is probably worth exploring is we put all the onus on each individual mitigation site with contingencies to be successful, and I don't think you can contingency your way out of future hypothetical problems. On the land trust side, they have legal defense funds, and every single project collects a fee, and it goes into a pooled, like nationwide defense fund that can then step in on those very few occurrences where something does go bad. And I think maybe that's an approach we need to start looking at, is how do you pool the risk and everybody pays in a little bit like an insurance program, rather than try to make each project have to pay for a potential hypothetical, because you could never afford to account for all of that in the finances. So that's my penny and a half thought.
It was good. That was a valuable penny. Well, it's 3 o'clock, and technically we're done. And I don't have a magical wrap-up other than we are going to be talking more on Thursday, and have a few presenters, including the public, the school state lands from Mindy, and many of us are going to be around this whole week and would love to continue to have this conversation. And if it's a conversation, and actually I will say one thing, if you have case studies that you think are worthwhile, that's probably the number one, action item that as a group, I'd love to continue to pull those together. So Let me know. I'm going to make a little survey that you can just go to and fill out some information. So, and otherwise, thank you for joining us today, and have a good rest of your conference.